If you've ever owned a Volvo 240, 740, or 940, you know about the taillight issues that these things have. I'm going to show you the way that I solved this problem that I think is the cheapest, easiest, most long-term solution to failing taillights on these cars. After we disconnect our battery, we got to get in the trunk here and take off this protective cover that covers the taillights on the inside of the trunk. After we have the protective cover off of the taillights on the inside of the trunk, we need to loosen all of these nuts here on these studs so we can take the taillight out. We also need to loosen this ground here and remove this connector. After all those fasteners are out, this assembly will just pull right out. So here we have our assembly. First, we're going to carefully remove this insulation without damaging it. Set that aside. And we're going to take out all of these little bulbs and their sockets. So here you can see part of the problem. This plastic and copper contact board will corrode over time. This one actually doesn't look too bad, but it still wasn't working. But there is corrosion here where these tabs on these sockets contact this circuit board. So these will corrode over time. This ground that's soldered in here, this will also crack and corrode over time, and so you'll lose your ground and that will no longer work. And also where the connector plugs in right here, you can also experience corrosion right here, which it looks like we have some, and some wearing away of the contact material. Another possible failure point is in this connector itself. You can experience corrosion, which leads to poor contacts. It looks like we had a little bit of an issue on one of these contacts here for this red wire, it looks like. I'm sure that was also part of the problem. So one thing that a lot of people do is they'll just buy a new one of these and put it back in. And this one actually doesn't look original. This one looks like it's been replaced already, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do something that's an even better solution. So we're going to carefully remove this and discard it. Yeah, this one's definitely been replaced. This isn't an original one. So this one has definitely been replaced. It's not original and it still failed over time. So buying a new one of these is not a permanent solution. So we've still got our battery disconnected, and the next thing we're going to do is we are going to cut off this connector and strip off a little bit of insulation from each of these wires. For this next step, you want to make sure that these bare wires aren't going to make contact with any metal or with each other. Now we're going to reconnect our battery and turn our accessories on one at a time, starting with our taillights. For this next step, you're going to need a multimeter or a test light. In this case, we're using a multimeter. We have it set to DC voltage. Our black probe is touching a piece of bare metal and it's grounded. We have our taillights on, so we are going to probe each of these wires until we get a reading to find out which one is the taillights. There we go. So when we touch this red wire, we get a reading of 11.1 volts, which is what the battery's at right now because this battery is really low. So we know this is our taillight wire. So we're going to take a piece of tape, we're going to label it, and we're going to stick it on that wire so we know what it is. So now we have our taillights turned off and we have our left turn signal on. So I'm going to probe these wires to find out which one is the left turn signal. When you're probing to find out which one's the turn signal, your test light or your multimeter is going to pulse because the turn signal is intermittent. We're going to do the same thing for the brake lights. You can have someone step on the brakes, or you can just do what I did and jam a shovel in there so that the brakes are depressed. And right there, we've got a reading of 11.3 volts. So this yellow white wire is our brake light wire. Then you can do the same thing for the reverse lights by having someone sit in the car with the car on in reverse, and you'll be able to find out which one of these powers the reverse lights. This next step requires some modification of these bulb sockets. What you're going to need is a pair of pliers, and you're going to go around these tabs here, around these metal tabs, you're just going to use the pliers to break away some of the plastic that makes up these sockets. So you want to have plenty of space here to access this tab. It doesn't matter if it gets a little mangled, it really doesn't matter. You just want to be able to access this tab. Now what a lot of people do is they'll take the wires in the back of the car that we just identified for the different accessories and they'll solder them on the back of these tabs. We're not going to do that. Solder is not going to work well long term in this situation. Really for any automotive situation, the only thing you should be soldering would be a relay to re-tin the contacts if a relay has cracked or something like that. Solder can break, it can crack because it's subject to vibration in automotive applications, so you really shouldn't be soldering things. At least that's what I've found, is solder is not going to hold up long term in this situation. So what we're going to use are these female quick slides. I have these insulated ones because they're going to work best for this application, but a standard 1/4 inch quick slide, which is what I have here, is not going to fit on there. Now they do make 3/8 inch quick slides, but I don't have any of those right now and I don't like using them anyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pair of mini bolt cutters that I have, or you could use a die grinder or a bench grinder or whatever, and we're going to remove just a little bit on the end of each of these tabs so that these female quick slides will fit over them. Only got to remove a little bit, just like that. See, and now it slides right over, and that's a good secure fit. You're also going to need to make a ground cable for each one of these sockets because the ground used to come through the circuit board, but it's not going to anymore. So I have a female quick slide on one end of this green wire and then a ring terminal on the other end of this green wire. I'm going to make one of these for each of these sockets so that they can be grounded. Alright, so now we're going to want to put our female quick slides on these wires that we labeled. One thing that I did is I split the tail light wires because I'm going to have these two lights here be both tail lights. So when the tail lights are on, both of these lights here closest to the license plate will be on because I like that. I like that look a lot better. This top one was originally wired to be a rear fog light, I believe, on this car, but the two lights over here are both going to be tail lights when the car is on. And then we also attached all the ground cables that we made here to the stock ground location. You're going to want to use connectors that are going to fit better. These yellow connectors are made for 10 to 12 gauge wire. This is gauge 14 wire, so I had to double the wires over, but that's what I had. So, and then these ring terminals are too big too, so I had to use a washer when I was reinstalling it, but everything's tight and that'll be a good ground. But if you have the right terminals, or you can go out and get them, go and get the right terminals, but this is what I use and it's still going to work totally fine. Now's also a good time to get in here and clean up behind the tail light housing. A lot of junk can get in here, and that can be really bad for this housing area here. The metal can start to rust. So clean that up while you're in here. It's a good opportunity to clean this up and to clean up your tail lights. Now you can put all your bulbs back in the sockets and put them back in the housing. One thing that I do is I use LED bulbs whenever I'm doing this job instead of these old incandescent style bulbs, because the LED bulbs produce less heat, which is one of the reasons that these housings will fade and crack and distort over time, and you need to replace them. So these LED bulbs, they're a little brighter, they run a little cooler, and they're just a little bit better to use. So I always use these LED bulbs. You can use the stock ones though. So put your taillight assembly back in. Don't over tighten these nuts on these studs because you can break the plastic housing. And then put all your quick slides on. You may have to bend the tabs on these sockets just a little bit to get all the quick slides on, but it's not that big of a deal. All this is kind of a mess right now, but I'm gonna clean it up later. All these wires So once everything's connected, reconnect your battery and then do a little test to make sure everything's working the way it should. One thing I should mention, when you're doing the passenger side on a 240, you want to make sure you reconnect your grounds here, because one of these grounds, one of these black wires, I don't know if you can really see it, but this one right here is actually the ground for your license plate lights. So if you don't reconnect that, your license plate lights won't work. So excuse this mess and everything. I don't have everything tucked in yet, but make sure you reconnect your ground here. And if you find after this that your license plate lights aren't working, the first thing to check would be your grounds, because they're on an independent 12-volt supply. So you're not going to mess with the 12-volt supply for the license plate lights when you're doing this job, but you may accidentally disconnect the ground. Both of mine are burnt out, so I got to change them anyway, but just one thing to note. So that's really all you've got to do to fix the taillights on your 240 or 740 sedan. I didn't hook up the reverse lights on this yet because they're not hooked up to the transmission that we swapped in anyway, so they wouldn't work anyway. It's not a perfect solution because you do have to modify the sockets a little bit by taking off some of the material and modifying the tabs a little bit by removing some of the material on those to get the quick slides to fit. But it is the best solution that I've found that works long term. It'll prevent you from getting a ticket. It may even prevent you from getting into an accident. It's really easy to do. It's really cheap. It's a lot cheaper than buying a new board and putting it in there. You know, electrical connectors are only a few dollars, and all you have to have are some basic electrical tools like a wire stripper and a multimeter or a test light to do this. So it's definitely worth doing. So the procedure is the same for both sides. It's real easy, really straightforward. If you haven't done it yet and you're having taillight problems, you should definitely give it a shot.